Hi, this is All Games Rue podcast number 14 and yours truly, Vирджил.
And Dimaus.
Do not be alarmed as today's program marks a linguistic departure from our usual routine, and likely our today's guest is to blame for that. So we'd like to introduce Scary Fan, whose knowledge in both video games and cinema is very comprehensive, which is going to be very handy now, as today we would like to discuss the exact relationships between the worlds of video game and film, how they perceive and affect each other, and how the process have changed through the years.
I'm glad to be here with you guys, fellow lovers of old video games, and I hope to enlighten your audience with some of our discussion.
Right, so actually we kind of touched that theme in our previous programs when we discussed non-linear narrative, non-linear gameplay, and of course the topic of comparison of movies and video games kind of chimed in. But today we would like to discuss a somewhat different topic. So if we try to compare video games with movies, there is actually a huge gap between them, between the appearance of both art forms, about 80 years, which separates the start of beginning of motion pictures as we know them at the very end of the 19th century and that of video games in 1970s. Of course, we want to try to discuss a space war that was played on some huge mainframe in the States, and just like we want to discuss some earlier experiments with trying to capture someone on primitive camera. So around 80 years separates both mediums, and well, maybe we would try to trace similarities in how both genres evolved. So at the time the film was already a major art form, in the 70s, with a huge industry surrounding it, while games were still in infancy, with such pioneering titles as Punk, Asteroids, Night Driver, and so on. They just appeared on the market. Anyway, Scary Fan, what was the time when this arcade, clubs or arcades started to appear throughout the cities and become somewhat popular?
I think it was around late 70s and early 80s. I remember first going to an arcade around that time when I was in high school at the time.
I see. So at first I think they had these mechanical machines, right? And then they moved to electronical ones. Is it so, or I am mistaken?
Yeah, there were some old type mechanical type machines, yes. Then the first computer games that were in the arcades, like you mentioned, Pong and Asteroids, the Space Invaders.
Mm-hmm.
Those became popular, and more people started to attend these arcades. And I think when Pac-Man came around and the Mario Brothers, that's when it really became very popular.
So it became kind of subculture thing.
Sure, yes. At the time there was no other entertainment beside movies and TV, and books obviously, but it was very popular with kids and going to video arcades. There was no home computers at the time, so people visited them to play games on, and it grew from there.
So they dropped some huge bucks on these coins to just play game for how many minutes? What was the usual play time? 5 minutes, 3 minutes, even less?
Yeah, per quarter, yes. Depending, how well you did. But games at the time, were very difficult compared to nowadays, right? They were meant to be played on screen, and you would attempt to beat the high score each time, right?
So, well, nowadays the situation is different because the games have also, as movies, have enormous budgets. Nowadays there is a much wider audience of video games. That's why one of the reasons why they became more simpler, so they can offer entertainment for everyone without much problems to get enough skill to just play the game. Actually, I decided to discuss this topic because several years ago, a screenwriter for one of the Call of Duty Modern Warfare games, I don't recall now which one exactly it was, but he received a prestigious prize for his work on the game, for a screenplay he wrote. Well, let's admit the fact that it was only given to the members of the Screenwriters Guild, but I think nevertheless it's just milestone achievement for video game industry. So also in some countries like Great Britain, video games are outselling the music, DVDs and movie tickets. Actually, I found this article on The Guardian, which says in 2009 became a country's most valuable purchased entertainment market, which were bigger than DVDs, so music sales combined, and more than 4 times cinema box office takings. So video games over the years became a force to be reckoned with.
Maybe we will start with beginning with early 80s. It is very interesting to understand how it started in United States and in Europe because we don't know it. So the question is, was it really a competition between video games industry and film industry in that time? Or was it film industry didn't notice the games at all?
At the time, due to the games being very simple, obviously they only had, pixel type graphics. There wasn't really that much competition with movies themselves, because movies, were such more profitable as far as money making.
Yes, but game industry was very fast growing.
Yes.
So until this collapse in the 1893, there were quite a lot of companies of arcade machines, of consoles, and so on. And some movies tried to address this new phenomena.
Yes, at the time, obviously, as video game culture grew, movies would put those scenes, especially if they involve teenagers or kids in the movie, sometimes they would go to arcades and play games, and it just became a way of, showing the culture of the kids at the time. I've noticed, in recent years, obviously there's not as much showing of video games in movies because they've, like Virджil said, it has grown, beyond movies. It's a much more popular industry now than movies are. So I think movie studios don't want to promote video games anymore since they're a competition for them, right?
So you think there's a direct competition between these two?
Yes, obviously.
So it is only now, not back in the 80s?
I think in the 80s, yeah, it was less, obviously, but now there's such a big industry. People only have a certain amount of money to spend on entertainment, and if they buy it,
They vote with their wallets.
yeah, so if they're spending $60 for a game, they're not gonna be able to see so many different movies, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've read that people think that video games are more cost-effective way of getting entertainment because they can play it over and over, the game, whereas a movie you see it once, and rarely do you see them more than once.
But in the recent years, the last 10 years, I think the games started to become more streamlined form of entertainment. And today I think we should discuss it. But anyway, let's start from the start. So, in your opinion, how the depiction and attitude to video games in cinema changed throughout the years? How the directors and writers portrayed video game culture then and now?
At first, I've noticed that in the very early days of video games, where you only had Pong-type games, they did appear in a few movies, science fiction type movies, and basically they tried to use them as a futuristic type device, because people didn't have knowledge of playing games at the time.
Like a high-tech pinball machine or something like that.
Yes, there's an early movie called Soylent Green. It used, a video game, basically showing, in the far future, yet they're only showing a video game with very primitive technology, which was sort of, a conundrum. And then you have movies like Star Wars, where they showed an animated chess type game with holographic pieces, which I think later they used that in a video game, animated chess type game, right?
Yes, there was a game like that called Aircon, I believe.
Oh, yeah, okay. Throughout the 80s, as video games became more popular, they would show arcade scenes in games, and I think at the time they were used as a way of showing people having fun, compared to somebody playing a console game right now, it's not a cinematic way of showing somebody having fun, right? You're sitting on a couch, with a controller. It's not something people would want to see in a movie. Whereas, on arcade, you have little flashing lights and sounds, and I think that's why one of the reasons.
Like a club or something.
Yes.
For special needs people.
So it was something more cinematic to show in the movie. And that's why I think one of the reasons they don't show them anymore, console tape games.
Yes, well, first, I agree with you on Soylent Green. I actually seen that movie, and yes, I remember they had this arcade cabinet back then, and was some very primitive game.
Yes.
I was surprised to find out that this was one of the first appearances of video games in cinema. The movie, in fact, came out in 1974, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, around that time.
But there was a film which is much more important to our today's issue, because the producer of this film, he was fascinated at the time with emerging video games and as well as computer graphic effects, and he thought he could make it available and known to a broader audience by making a movie on the topic. And this movie is Tron,
Yes.
in fact shown by Disney. As I've read that many of the film companies he approached outright denied him because they thought it was just ridiculous, but Disney agreed and this movie became a hit. Basically, I don't need to explain what this movie is about. It's about some guy who's designing video games in real life, and then he gets sucked in virtual space, and they have very particular way of showing this virtual space, very artistic. To the point that the film was shot in black and white, and these video game sequences were hand-colored by a different company to make these special effects, and it also has some computer-generated graphics in the form of Tron bikes. They had some kind of bike race in the film. It was one of the first examples of movies where video games were taken seriously by the makers of this film, without dumbing it down to just, look at these nerds playing some stupid electronic games. What do you think about that?
For sure, yeah, it was a very revolutionary film at the time. Now you've seen it where, there's video game characters in our world, like, Wreck-It Ralph recently, or Spy Kids 3D, where kids enter a video game universe. And but at the time, Tron was one of the very first, and for a long time after, there weren't any other produced.
Yeah, but there was a large gap between Tron and Wreck-It Ralph. No serious movies between. Why it was so?
You mean that there were no movies that portrayed the video game world as a central topic of the film?
Enter the video game world inside.
I'm not sure about that,
computer.
because there was a different film which was about virtual reality called Lawn Mower.
But it's not about games.
Well, it's about virtual reality anyway.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Not quite, yes, not exactly
quite,
a video
yes.
game, but just, yes, a virtual world. And what exactly are video games if they're not just, same virtual reality world? Just depends on your point of view, how do you view them. But actually, I can remember several movies that talk about it, some quite cheaply produced, B-style movies. After the success of Mortal Kombat, the film, as a video only. I don't remember the name, but yes, it was something about that. There was also Jackie Chan film where he got his head stuck in an arcade machine, gets electrocuted, and then he thinks he's in Street Fighter game.
Yes.
Dressed as different characters, but it's just a minor example.
Yes, they've also used video games as something where somebody becomes trapped inside, like you mentioned. There have been more horror-type movies, like Brain Scan in 1994. Basically, somebody is trapped with an evil character inside a game, and, they're risking life and death with it. Also, Freddy's Dead in 1991, one of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies. There's a scene where a kid becomes trapped in a nightmare, and he's a video game character, and Freddy has actually a power glove on, one of the old Nintendo power gloves, in place of his, claws.
Yes, I vaguely remember that scene.
Using it in horror-type circumstances has been done by several movies.
Well, yes, the theme of isolation, of being caught in alien environments. Well, I think that we should move to the second question I'd like to discuss today, and that is, what was the first time you heard the term cinematic used for advertisement in video game? Is there actually a game that could be really called that way? Cinematic game, cinematic gameplay?
The first time I've heard of it was Dragon's Lair, I think, 1983. That was a revolutionary game which used a laser disc in the video arcade. And basically it's an interactive movie where you choose the direction you want the animation to move, whether it's left, right, up, down, or perform some action, right? And basically it had the quality of a modern animated movie at the time. It was done by Don Bluth, and who had done Disney films in the past. And, home computers at the time couldn't produce animation of studio quality, of a movie type quality, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the first time I remember seeing, something sort of similar to a movie being played as a game.
You mentioned this first Laserdisc type games, but even from gameplay perspective, they were very primitive, even much more primitive than other games that were available at the time. Being it's, I don't know, even more primitive in Punk or something like that, because only thing you could do is just press the right button at the right time. It was very limited. If you press the wrong button, you would see a scene of most likely your animated demise of your character. But as I realized, these games were very popular, right? Because even today we see them being remastered, and it has so many different re-editions. It just puzzles me. Why would people want to see exactly the same thing on the screen after all these 30 years? Then there are games that could offer you much more.
Yeah, later on it developed, I think, Alone in the Dark, those types of games where it had cinematic angles of scenes, which led to Resident Evil after that. That sort of started to look like you were playing within the movie, and you had 3D characters which you could move around, but again with a fixed angle of the camera. I think later on it developed again where you had interactive cutscenes like in Half-Life, where you played and you reach a certain point in the game and something would happen where you could see characters talking to you and affect the action somehow.
Well, strictly speaking, Half-Life didn't have any cutscenes because, cutscenes is where you can't act, just being shown how the environment around you evolves or something like that.
Yes, they were in-game cutscenes, like it used the certain characters you would meet and they would start speaking to you. So it's like an in-game cutscene is what I mean.
Well, actually, if we talk about cutscenes, I would like to remember a game called Karateka from 1984, because it is considered, at least by Wikipedia, to be one of the first games which used cutscenes. It was basically one of the first fighting games as well, and between fighting different characters, between advancing from one screen to another, player was shown how the plot advances. In a very primitive way, but yet it was the first. And this guy later, he designed also several games called Prince of Persia. Well, also I'd like to remember an interesting game. It's called Amazon, by renowned author Michael Crichton. Michael Crichton, who is the author of Jurassic Park and many other movies. So basically he's also made one game, very early adventure game, designed as an interactive fiction with graphics. It may be interesting from that standpoint that he's such a prime-time Hollywood screenwriter, and goes down to designing a video game, and there were only 3 people involved in design, one who made the graphics, and he and another guy who did the programming. It also brings us to a different question as how the directors, how they perceive game designers, and how do they approach the video game design thing. So Dimaus, I think you had something on the topic.
I was interested in this topic and found that indeed some of well-known directors used to design games, or at least make scripts for the video games, like Steven Spielberg, who did a script for The Dig, which was not used in the final game, but some ideas, some things he created. Also, the guys who created the film Matrix, maybe Scary Fan knows more about this.
Well, I understand what you're trying to say. It's Wachowski brothers. They also made a game, or participated in creation of a game. I think was called Enter the Matrix. Yes.
Yeah, and actually I didn't play it, but I read about how it was accepted, and it was not a big success. People think this is a bit mediocre and a bit dull. Okay, but some of the directors used to approach this video games market, and even big companies like Disney, like Lucasfilm, had their video game branches. They were very successful at the 90s.
Yes, the LucasArts did bring this Star Wars to the computer market.
Yeah, and adventures, not even connected to the franchises from the movies.
Well, there's one game actually I'd like to remember. It's lesser known game. I'm not sure if you ever heard of it. It's called Agent Wolf. It's a game from I think 1990. A game from a company called Dynamics. Dynamics was a branch of Sierra, and this game had both digitized actors and real-time cutscenes using the game engine. The game had a 3D engine. Basically, there were several episodes in this game in which you could participate as a player. Car chase, plane chase, or something like that. So basically, it was a very early attempt to build an interactive movie by actually letting player to participate in some of the stages, unlike the later interactive movies where basically all your interaction with the game was limited to just pressing the button at the right time to get a good result.
There is an interesting topic connected with this. When did actually real actors appeared in the games? I don't know. Maybe our expert can answer this.
Well, you mean like full motion video scenes, like the Tex Murphy games?
Yeah, but this was around mid-90s, but probably there was something earlier. I heard about some adventure which was even banned in some countries.
Oh, you probably mean Night Trap?
Yeah.
That was, had controversial scenes. Some government agents in the US tried to have it banned. Basically, I think it was overblown, the controversy, because what they claimed the game contained about, sex and murder and all that, there wasn't really, it was just hysteria.
Yeah, well, just what do you expect from a Sega game, anyway? Yes, interesting that a Sega CD, one of the early consoles of the 90s, also had a big amount of those FMV games. Most of the games were pretty bad, as far as I can tell, but it's kind of started this trend of introducing Hollywood actors to the world of video games. But actors, it's just like a job to them. Some value their reputation more than the others, so some are willing to try some new thing, well, some are more conservative. So I don't understand actually, Dimaus, I don't understand your question. Why are you interested in...
I was interested in when real actors appeared in the games.
Well, I think Scarifon has answered your question pretty much.
Yeah, basically when the CD-ROM device became popular, they had to have some content to fill, such a large content.
And also big budget enough to secure these actors.
Yes, so I think those type of movies which had, full video of scenes was one way to get people interested in CD-ROM. And later the game Myst popularized people purchasing it a lot. And that was with computer animation. So
yes, all these actors were brought to the production because people just thought that it would sell well.
Right.
Just like anything, I'm not sure if you know it or not, but I heard that when in the early 70s, just after the sexual revolution, some of the censorship laws in Europe were relaxed, so people could portray a lot of things. Actually, if they rated their movie accordingly, or I think in some countries you had to show your movie in a particular theaters, but you could show almost anything. And basically some of the countries, nearly whole countries, have taken another path, like Germany, that just started with sex comedies, and now when you say German movie, everyone thinks that you mention porn. So basically I think the situation in the mid-90s were pretty much like that. People just thought that, well, it's easier way to make money, so kind of marrying both video games and cinema, just the more direct way you can think it's possible. And as far as I know, it was both expensive and not very profitable. So that's why in around 97, 98, people just stopped investing money in this kind of games.
Yes, yeah. They had consoles which used CD-ROMs exclusively, like the 3DO, which, like you said, used these types of games. And they went bankrupt because the gameplay wasn't there. It was just, an interactive movie.
And this is it. this concludes part 1 of our podcast. Stay with us. The more is coming. Bye.